Hi everyone, this is Drew Wharton. Along with my colleagues at Nimble Leader, we've put together a multi-part webinar series titled Tactics for Profit Without Leaving Your Office. Our singular focus is to help you drive growth during these challenging times. The segment that begins within the next few seconds will provide tangible value on how to reduce cost now. Hang in there everyone, we hope to see you soon.
Reduce costs now. This is Drew Wharton along with my colleagues Ed Flanagan and Bruce Rubin. Now, Ed is Managing Director with Nimble Leader. He is also Director, Expense Reduction Analyst. He and his team of over 700 spend category consultants have access to 26 years of benchmark data, working with executives of mid-sized companies to tightly manage expenses to free up additional cash for both operations and growth. Bruce is also Managing Director with Nimble Leader. He is president of BHR Global with a specific focus on building international supply chain networks. Bruce has strategic supply chain relationships literally all over the world. I know everyone's on a tight time schedule, so without further delay, let's jump into the content of our webinar this morning. Do manufacturers manage indirect as well as they manage direct product costs? And when you and I spoke about this, I was actually surprised by your answer. You basically said, not always. Companies often overpay suppliers anywhere from 10 to 30%. And that seems like a huge number to me in terms of low-hanging fruit. Can you share your thoughts on why that's the case?
Well, Drew, the thing is they don't realize they're spending over 10 to 30% because they don't have benchmark data. And you got to remember the goal of all the suppliers is to win your business at the highest price that they can and then make it very difficult for you to get the lowest price.
Okay, and so that seems pretty significant. I mean, we can go into manufacturers and there are dollars that are just sitting there waiting to be recouped. And I know you have spoken about the top 10 procurement misconceptions, and I was also blown away with 90% of the engagements in terms of where you're involved, that the companies violate one or more of these principles. And I wonder if you could just share some thoughts on what you see most often.
Yeah, we see this very often. A couple examples are, oftentimes clients are very loyal to their suppliers. Sometimes they treat them like family, and this often leads to higher prices. We recently had an example where one of our clients had a big printing spend, and we reviewed it, and the client said that the prices have not gone up over the last 5 years. And everybody knows the new technology and things like that are happening in the printing industry. We got involved and we found over 62% savings in that category. The other thing is our clients may not be asking the right questions when they go and negotiate with their suppliers. There's a lot of possibilities to get rebates that they may not be aware of. And also sometimes another thing called prebates, which are actually rebates that you can get up front. So again, we found 90% of the cases, companies commit one or more of these misconceptions that contribute to them overspending 10 to 30%.
Okay, so that really seems significant. And what you've identified here in terms of specific examples seem very tangible to me. And I know that you and I have talked about this whole notion of the path to excellence, and that there are certain steps that organizations should follow really to maximize their efficiency. And I wonder if you could just share some thoughts relative to that.
Yeah, one of the things we find quite often is our clients aren't looking at their looking and analyzing their purchase history because they feel like they've been there last year. Why do they need to analyze it? And if they go in and look at the details, they can find a lot of things that'll be eye-opening. And a couple examples are, we had a client with 9 different locations, and they were getting a service for their uniforms. And in each location, they were getting charged different prices for the same service. Another example, we had a company that had telecommunication services for 10 years, and these services were never installed. And we were able to recover $90,000 savings in that instance. Another example, we had a client that was providing daycare services for their employees, and they were spending $19,000 a month on diapers. Once the CEO found out about that, she was very disappointed and was wondering where all those diapers were going.
So analyze and validate purchase history, talking about understanding suppliers and their industries. That seems like it's really key in terms of doing your homework and reevaluating the current supplier relationships. But I think one of the things I was most surprised about, I mean, you're a financial guy, pretty even keel, but you had a lot of energy and some emotion around this whole notion of decide, implement, and monitor. And I'm wondering why. Can you share why this is so important in this overall path to excellence?
Well, the thing is, when you're looking at reducing expenses, once you decide that you need to make a change or have the current supplier come in with the difference, with additional savings, you need to implement right away and stop the cash leaks. And then once you implement, you then have to monitor. You got to make sure that the prices that you negotiated stay in place, because the supplier feels that you don't have the time or energy to monitor those savings, and their goal is to get their margins back up. So you've got to do the implementation, you got to monitor to make sure the savings stick.
So they might close the deal with you. They're looking to potentially recoup over time because you may not necessarily have the time to be able to follow up. So decide, implement, and monitor is really key. So I'm wondering if you could just share with us some examples that you've had some success in the past.
Sure. We have a couple examples here where we found $660,000 in savings, which represented 47%. And they came from the incumbent supplier who had been raising prices over the last 5 years that were not in compliance with the contract. Another example, we found savings of 15%, which equated to 460,000 savings due to prices also increasing that were supposed to be tied to an index and were not. We were able to get that money back by reviewing the contract and making sure the supplier adheres to the contract. Another example, we had a manufacturing company with multiple sites, and we found over $900,000 savings with reduction of the number of suppliers down from 100 to 3 suppliers. And the nice thing there is not only were there hard dollar savings, we found also soft savings, because now the client only has to work with 3 suppliers instead of 100 suppliers.
It's a big learning. So if I'm an operator, line operator, CEO or chief operating officer, that's $660,000 in terms of lower chemical costs. If I'm trying to manage my business, especially during these challenging times, there's no change. You talk about the incumbent supplier, so there's no risk associated with that. And then as it relates to the MRO savings, I think it's really important the way that you've identified hard costs versus soft costs. And the notion of going from 100 suppliers down to 3, where my head goes is, can I redeploy some of those folks on my team to other areas to drive overall efficiency for the business? So really, really key. Now, I know that your overall domain expertise is in expense reduction, and we've talked about the 700 expense consultants, but there are elements here that are really important, I think, in terms of providing advantage to clients. Can you share some thoughts associated with that?
Sure. Those 700 consultants, they've got deep experience and benchmark data in the various supplier industries. And it's incredibly helpful in identifying specific and tangible opportunities for savings. And all of our consultants are focused on implementing and monitoring. And then you got to remember, we don't get paid until the savings are implemented. So our capacity is to implement. Will also free up the time for our clients to spend on other priorities that they may have.
Okay, really, really important. So this whole notion of the benchmark data, it's come up before, but the opportunity to identify the gaps, the deep pool of expertise in terms of the category-specific expense consultants, really, really key. And I always love to hear when we talk about the opportunity to free up valuable time so that leaders can really focus on what they need to focus on to drive the business forward. Now, we've kind of talked about the notion of how do we provide value to companies during these times without any incremental cash burn on the front end. And so that's the challenge we threw out to the group. And Ed, you brought up the fact that, look, if you can provide me with a trial balance of annual spend across categories, and that's something that can be just done over the internet. There doesn't necessarily have to be a meeting, that you can go to work. Can you just share some thoughts on what that means?
Sure. So our company, as Drew mentioned earlier, we've had 26 years of business. And over that time, we've conducted over 20,000 expense reviews. So we have what we call our knowledge base. And if a prospect would be willing to share with us their general ledger or trial balance, and all we need to see is the expenses, we don't need payroll or the balance sheet. What we can do is compare those costs with other companies in their industry and their size. And what it'll do is it'll kick out and show us where there's opportunities. And we can do a quick scan to see if there's cash being left on the table. And if there is, where the savings might be, how much we're talking about, and how we can get it back funding more of the company's initiatives.
Okay, so this is pretty powerful. Okay, so you're willing to do the work as it relates to the analysis against the benchmark data, and we identify where the opportunities are, the dollar amounts, and so then leadership has a choice, whether or not they want to move forward with us in this area or not. And then you've talked about the deliverables, assuming that a business does move forward. So can you share some thoughts associated with what those components are?
Sure. If a client is willing to engage with us, we'll provide a number of reports. The first thing is the baseline report. So in order for us to document that we're saving the company money, we have to document where we're at today. So we need to gather data to find out what it is that they're purchasing or what services they're getting and what they're currently paying for them. We also want to document what's important as far as quality and service. Once we get all that information, we come back to the client with a baseline report and ask them to sign off and make sure we have everything documented properly. Once they sign off, we then go out to the market with a very detailed RFP. We work with the current supplier and we bring in other suppliers that we've worked with in the past that can provide as good quality and service as they're getting now. And we ask them to respond to the RFP within 2 to 3 weeks. Once we get that information, we analyze it, we summarize it, and we come back to the client with a recommendation report. And that report will spell out the savings opportunity from their current supplier and other suppliers. And then we ask the client to select, where do you want to go? Which supplier do you want to work with? And once they make that decision, we work with the supplier to make sure all those prices are implemented in their system. And then for the next 2 years, every month, we provide an implementation, also known as a monitoring report. And that report will spell out what the savings are. We'll compare what they're spending today with what they were spending back when we did the baseline report. And then we'll also monitor to make sure that the current prices tie back to the contract to make sure that there's no price creep from the supplier where they might be increasing prices or changing products.
Okay, there we are with that implementation and monitoring and the compliance relative to the contract. This all seems like a ton of work relative to the businesses that we might be able to work with. And I'd probably want some dollars up front, but your perspective is a little bit different. Can you share your thoughts on approach to market here?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, we average savings on 90% of our projects. So in that case, we're willing to work on a contingent basis. So the way it works is that if we go in and analyze your spend and we can't find any savings, there's actually no fee. If we're successful in finding savings, again, from your current supplier or another supplier that provides as good or better quality and service, we share in those savings for 2 years. And after 2 years, the client receives 100% of the savings.
Okay. All right. So the timing looks pretty significant in the sense that you're able to get at the low-hanging fruit within 8 weeks. Very, very powerful. So Ed, thanks for the overall view in terms of approach here. Everyone, we'll have a follow-up email regarding next steps associated with this. What I'd like to do right now is just shift gears and move from the indirect to component costs, direct costs. And Bruce, you're our supply chain guru with global relationships. And oftentimes you tell me organizations need to maximize vendor efficiencies to minimize costs at every step across the supply chain to improve overall profitability. And I'm wondering if you just might share some thoughts relative to your view on the supply chain.
Okay. The supply chain begins with the suppliers of either raw materials or components or both. They're shipped to the manufacturing facility where they're transformed into finished goods, then moved to a warehouse and eventually the customer. At each spot in the chain here, there's ability for savings and maximizing efficiencies and minimizing costs, which eventually leads to the value chain. Like I say, each step in the process, the cost can be minimized and therefore your profit maximized.
I know we're going to focus on suppliers here, at least as
Right.
it relates to this session, but I think you really shifted my thinking here, Bruce, in the sense that the supply chain as a value chain can be really an area of competitive advantage. And then you've also talked about this notion of vendors as partners or the enemy. So can you share a little your background relative to this? What are you thinking here?
Well, what happens if you treat your suppliers as quote unquote the enemy, you end up at the end of the day paying more money because you're making it difficult for them. It becomes a transaction. You send them a PO, they send you the product, and it is obvious to them that you are not watching what's going on. Partnering with major suppliers, from my experiences, you visit their facilities, they visit your facilities, and working together in partnerships, come up with potential cost savings, product adjustments, and other areas where, again, costs can be minimized without affecting the quality of the product they're supplying, and in some cases actually make it even better.
Okay, so we move from transactional to relational. If I
Right.
juxtapose this with what we talked about with Ed, Ed brought up the fact that there's so many different categories that no individual business can have expertise or exposure over all those categories. You're kind of on the flip side, which is they're producing product. They have to be expert in certain categories. And so it would make sense that vendors would be treated as partners versus the enemy, because that's an area of competitive advantage. Okay, so sounds great. Can you share some examples in terms of where you had some success in the past?
Okay, here is a product that company I was working with wanted to implement, and as an add-on category to be able to sell customers they now had, as well as take away business from competitors at major retailers. The first major hurdle that we overcame was finding a supplier for the faucet for this add-on shower product. This is for a tub on legs, and worked with a contact who had a supplier of a low-cost, high-quality faucet that actually came from Israel. And through them and other contacts, found a fabrication facility in Brooklyn, New York, that could take the raw material, all the brass rods and tubes that were needed to complete the product, and have them not only fabricate, but have the product plated, all the components that company I was working with could supply, like the cartons and other raw material, other materials, were then all shipped directly to the supplier in Brooklyn, where we set up not only a manufacturing facility, but a distribution point. And once the project was completed, we achieved 100% on-time delivery to the retailers. And as you can see at the bottom here, it was a 12% revenue growth year over year for the company, and improved the margin mix shift by 50%.
Okay.
And again, it's working with suppliers and minimizing and working with the best way possible to bring a product with lowest cost.
Okay, so it seems very impressive, right? So manufacturing a component in the Middle East, fabrication in Brooklyn, New York, drop shipped all supplies, packaging components, achieve 100% on-time delivery to retail distribution centers. That's a big one. And so without even changing the strategy for the overall business in terms of approach to market, to grow revenue by 12% with a positive margin mix shift of 50%, has a huge positive impact to the bottom line. So very, very significant. Okay, how about this example here?
Company that I was working with, who used hundreds of thousands, if not millions of yards of vinyl a year, received a price increase of 5% on $2.5 million worth of purchases from their vinyl supplier. After reviewing other potential resources, went back and already had told the supplier that this was unacceptable. And what can we do to solve not have the price increase. Having visited the supplier a number of occasions and they visiting our facility as well, came up with a solution that became a win-win. And again, it's a working relationship that was a partnership. And it turned a 5% price increase into a 3% price decrease. And we had to make the company had to make one change, and that is receive the rolls of vinyl instead of an 125 yards, 500 yard rolls. And I went back to the people from the company and said, we can't handle 500 yard rolls. And they said, well, there's a piece of equipment that'll help you, and it costs $2,500, and we'll pay for half. So for $1,250, we turned a 5% price increase into a 3% price decrease, which became a $200,000 favorable variance. And as a side benefit, because of the amount of yards that could be cut in from rolls to sheets, the total overtime for that department went from about $20,000 a year to zero, which was, a unintended consequence, but turned out to be a good thing.
Okay, so significant. And this is a perfect example of what you're talking about in terms of working with vendors as partners versus the enemy. This truly is a win-win. And when I see an 8% spread in terms of 5% price increase to a 3% decrease with a favorable cost variance of $200,000, and there was just an incremental charge of roughly $1,200 for a piece of equipment, huge, very, very significant. Okay, so if you could share a little bit about how you actually deliver these kind of results. What are some of the keys?
Well, I work with manufacturers and resources from the USA, local to where I live, to Israel, Germany, Taiwan, Malaysia, China, and other places. And each one, when I have a product that needs sourcing, I will reach out to the companies, not only here, but across the world, to see what is the best cost possible for that product. And what is the not only the cost of the product, but what's involved in tooling and other costs that might affect the final decision. And as you can see, we can cover almost any type of manufacturing. And in one case, had a customer where he was supplying a finished good to his customer, and worked out pricing, not only pricing that was favorable, but terms that were favorable, where he never took any money out of his pocket, because the terms we worked out were he was being paid for his delivery before he had to pay the company that was supplying the finished goods. And that happened for over 2 million pieces of that he delivered over a period of time.
Okay, so significant. So trusted manufacturing partners all across the world. And I know that you work with a lot of manufacturers locally.
Yes.
Manufacturing expertise, very broad. I always love to hear cash neutral positions, which is the example that you shared. The return's almost infinite. So really quite significant. Now, in terms of the overall process, there are certain things that you need to get started, and then you have a typical timing. Can you share your path as it relates to both?
In 99% of the cases, we need detailed specifications and blueprints for the product. We would be willing, we're willing to sign NDAs to protect the company from their information getting into quote unquote the wrong hands, and have one actually in process at the moment. Also, in rare cases, we will need a sample of the product if it's unique and different, and there are certain things that have to be seen. And I just completed a project where we needed a sample so that the people re-engineering the product could ensure that they were not infringing on any patents that existed on the product. Typically, to get a product from once we receive the specs and the prints, 7 to 10 days to get a good quote. Tooling typically runs about 6 weeks or so, and then the delivered product 8 to 12 weeks, again depending on where it's coming from. So within, if you count proposal, say 2 weeks, you got 8 weeks after with total for tooling and 12. So within 20 weeks or about 5 months, we can deliver a product to the customer.
Okay, very significant. So with a short period of time, 5 months, product is delivered to the doorstep. Very key and significant. And then approach to market, Bruce, typically, what's the process there?
Well, we work similar to Ed on a contingency basis. We charge 5 to 10% commission of the delivered cost of the product for the first year that the product is purchased from our vendor. And once the year is up, all the savings that we've delivered go to our customer. If we have no savings, then, obviously we're not making any money. But we do ask, similar to Ed, for the cost that they are now incurring upfront, so we know what our target needs to be.
All right. Well, great. Ed, Bruce, great session. Thank you for the input that you've had in terms of both your areas of expertise. Everyone, if you have questions about what we covered this morning, please feel free to reach out to Ed, Bruce, or myself. All right, everybody. I wanted to say thank you. This brings us to the end of our session, and we hope to hear from you soon.